All right, so today we're diving into some really fascinating history. We've got some sources here about a ruler who reigned for almost 50 years,
Wow.
expanded an empire, but then chose to be buried in a simple grave marked only with a patch of dirt.
Huh, interesting.
That's Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, and it seems like his final resting place in Kuldabad, India, is at the center of a modern-day political storm.
Yeah, it's remarkable how a seemingly simple tomb can ignite such passions even centuries later. I think this deep dive into Aurangzeb will take us through his controversial legacy, particularly in the Maharashtra region, and explore how that legacy is playing out even today.
Yeah, it's so interesting because Aurangzeb's reign seems so full of contradictions. He was a devout Muslim who employed more Hindus in his administration than any previous Mughal emperor, but he also reimposed that jizya tax on non-Muslims. And while known as this fearsome warrior, he spent his later years in pursuits like sewing caps and copying the Quran.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember the context here. The Mughal Empire was vast and diverse, encompassing various religious and cultural groups. Aurangzeb's policies, including the jizya, need to be seen within that complex landscape.
Yeah, that's a great point. So
Right.
how does this devout yet seemingly austere side of Aurangzeb connect to his choice of a simple tomb?
Well, his tomb in Kuldabad is incredibly modest, especially when compared to the opulent mausoleums of his Mughal predecessors. It really reflects his personal beliefs and instructions laid out in his will.
Okay, I'm really curious about this will now. What does it say?
So Aurangzeb's will stipulated a frugal burial, directing that the expenses be covered by a small sum he earned from sewing caps. He even wanted the money he made copying the Quran to be donated to the poor. It emphasizes his rejection of extravagance and his commitment to simplicity, even in death.
It's incredible how he even chose to be buried in a plain white cloth, foregoing all the traditional Mughal pomp and ceremony. It seems like such a powerful statement.
Absolutely. And this frugality stands in stark contrast to the grandeur we often associate with the Mughals, particularly with iconic structures like the Taj Mahal, built by his great-grandfather Shah Jahan.
Speaking of contrast, Aurangzeb's legacy in the Maharashtra region is anything but peaceful. His relationship with the Marathas, especially their leader, Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, was marked by intense conflict. Can you tell us a bit more about the Marathas and why their resistance to Mughal rule was so significant?
Sure. The Marathas were a powerful warrior clan who had established a strong presence in the Deccan Plateau. They had a distinct cultural and religious identity, and Shivaji Maharaj's leadership galvanized their resistance against what they perceived as Mughal encroachment on their land and autonomy.
Yeah, and Shivaji Maharaj is still a revered figure in Maharashtra, a symbol of their struggle for independence. And Aurangzeb's actions, particularly the execution of Shivaji's son Sambhaji Maharaj in 1689, really solidified a deep-seated resentment towards him within the Maratha community.
Right. And that resentment is still palpable today, especially when we consider the recent renaming of Aurangabad to Chhatrapati Sambhajinagar in 2022. This renaming signifies a symbolic reclaiming of history and an attempt to diminish Aurangzeb's legacy in the region.
It's almost like a direct response to Aurangzeb choosing to make that region his base in the later years of his reign. And then, as if this historical tension wasn't enough, we have a modern political storm brewing around Aurangzeb's tomb, sparked by politician Abu Azmi's comments. What did he say that reignited this debate?
Well, Azmi suggested that Aurangzeb was perhaps more pragmatic than fanatical, even pointing out that the Mughal army included Hindu generals and Shivaji's forces had Muslim soldiers. He seemed to be calling for a more nuanced understanding of the historical figures.
That attempt at nuance didn't go over too well, did it?
Not at all. No, not at all. The backlash was swift and fierce, with accusations of historical revisionism and demands for an apology. It really highlights the sensitivity surrounding historical figures like Aurangzeb and how their interpretations are often tied to contemporary political and social dynamics.
Yeah, it certainly demonstrates how easily seemingly simple comments can escalate into huge controversies, especially when dealing with such polarizing historical figures. And this controversy didn't just simmer online. BJP MP Udaydanraje Basal, a descendant of Shivaji Maharaj, responded to Azmi's comments with fiery calls for Aurangzeb's tomb to be demolished.
Yeah, Pasal actually went beyond just disagreeing. He used really charged language, calling Aurangzeb a thief and robber, and even called for a JCB excavator to raise the tomb.
And his rhetoric clearly struck a nerve. There were riots in Nagpur, with protesters burning effigies of Aurangzeb and demanding the tomb's destruction. The city was placed under curfew as clashes with police broke out and vehicles were set on fire.
Yeah, it's alarming how quickly historical grievances can be mobilized to incite violence in the present. It shows the potential for danger when political figures use such charged language, especially in a context where historical wounds run so deep.
And so, while Nagpur was experiencing this unrest, the actual tomb in Kuldabad was heavily guarded but remained relatively peaceful. It's almost surreal to picture this quiet, unassuming grave suddenly at the center of such chaos.
I know. The tomb's caretaker, Parvez Kabir Ahmed, expressed his bewilderment at the sudden frenzy. He urged people to ignore unfounded rumors and focus on the historical facts.
It raises an important question for us. Is this truly about a tomb, or is it a symptom of something much deeper? Are we seeing history being used as a political tool to further contemporary agendas?
That's a crucial question, and it speaks to the larger issue of historical revisionism. It can be a legitimate academic exercise to re-examine history with new evidence or perspectives, but it can also be manipulated to serve political goals.
So how do we discern between genuine historical inquiry and attempts to rewrite history for political gain? Are those calling for the demolition of Aurangzeb's tomb trying to erase history, or are they reacting to the very real consequences of his actions centuries ago?
It's likely a complex mix of both. Aurangzeb's actions towards the Marathas, especially the execution of Sambhaji Maharaj, were undeniably brutal and have left a lasting scar on the collective memory of the region. But using that historical grievance to justify violence in the present is a dangerous path.
It seems like we're walking a tightrope here, trying to acknowledge and learn from the past without becoming trapped by it.
Exactly. And this isn't just limited to Aurangzeb. We see similar controversies erupting around other historical figures in India, like Tipu Sultan, the 18th century ruler of Mysore.
Ah, yes. Tipu Sultan, another figure whose legacy is hotly debated. Was he a freedom fighter resisting British colonialism, or a tyrannical ruler who persecuted Hindus? The narrative seemed to vary so drastically depending on who's telling the story.
Precisely. And those conflicting narratives are often used to fuel political agendas, turning history into a battleground for competing ideologies.
It's concerning how these debates often descend into a simplistic binary of good versus evil, completely ignoring the nuances and complexities of history.
We lose sight of the fact that these were real people operating within specific historical contexts. Trying to fit them into neat categories of hero or villain does a disservice to the complexities of the past.
It feels like everyone is trying to claim ownership of history, using it to legitimize their present-day actions and beliefs.
What's crucial is to ask what we can learn from these historical figures and events. How can we understand their actions within the context of their time without condoning or glorifying their mistakes?
That's the real challenge, isn't it? To learn from the past without being consumed by it. It seems like we as a society are still struggling to figure that out.
We are. And until we find a way to engage with history in a more nuanced and respectful way, these cycles of outrage and historical revisionism are likely to persist.
So how do we even begin to have meaningful conversations about these controversial historical figures without it devolving into chaos? Especially in today's world where social media can amplify those very tensions we're talking about.
It's definitely a challenge in our current climate, but it's not impossible. I think the first step is acknowledging the complexity. Recognizing that history is rarely black and white, and that these figures were human beings with both flaws and virtues.
You're right. We need to move beyond those simplistic good guy versus bad guy narratives that dominate these discussions. But how do we get people to embrace that nuance when they're so deeply entrenched in their own interpretations of the past?
It requires a willingness to engage with differing perspectives, even if they challenge our own preconceived notions. We need to foster an environment where people can voice their opinions without fear of being silenced or demonized.
It sounds like you're advocating for a more empathetic and nuanced approach to discussing history, even when it involves figures as controversial as Aurangzeb.
Exactly. And perhaps those spaces for dialogue can emerge even around seemingly divisive sites like Aurangzeb's tomb.
That's an intriguing thought. You're saying that the tomb itself could become a catalyst for reconciliation and understanding rather than a symbol of division.
It's not outside the realm of possibility. Remember, the tomb itself has remained a silent observer throughout this entire controversy. It's a testament to the fact that history, unlike human emotions, can endure even the most heated debates.
That's a powerful point. The tomb could represent our shared history, reminding us that however complex and uncomfortable the past may be, it's a part of who we are.
And by engaging with that past, even the parts that we might find difficult or troubling, we can start to heal old wounds and build a more inclusive and understanding society.
It's been quite a journey exploring Aurangzeb's life. You know, his legacy and the controversies that still swirl around him today.
It really highlights how history is never truly settled. It's constantly being reinterpreted and debated.
Yeah, and for you, our listener, I hope this deep dive has provided a more nuanced understanding of this complex historical figure. We've covered so much ground, from his personal beliefs and political decisions to the enduring impact of his actions on the present day.
And we always encourage our listeners to keep exploring. There are countless resources available online about the Mughal Empire Maratha history and the ongoing debates surrounding historical figures like Aurangzeb. Even virtual tours of his tomb are available.
Yeah. It's fascinating to think that while we're having this conversation, that unassuming tomb in Kuldabad stands as a silent witness to these centuries-old debates. And hey, if you ever find yourself in the region, consider visiting the tomb in person.
Yeah, it's one thing to read about it, but to actually stand in that space surrounded by the weight of history can offer a whole new perspective.
Maybe it can even help us grapple with these complex questions about how we reconcile with the past and shape our future.
History isn't just about remembering, it's about understanding and learning.
And on that note, we'll leave you with this thought. If a simple grave can spark such passionate debate, imagine the power we have to create a more inclusive and understanding world. A world where we engage with history thoughtfully and respectfully, even when it challenges our assumptions. Thanks for joining us in this deep dive, and until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.